So, good day, everyone. Welcome again to our next CultureOS episode. Um, as usual, an enormous pleasure to welcome our guest, Jason Leavy, to the podcast today. Now, Jason's all about mastering the human system. So he looks at body, mind, emotion. He's a sportsman. He's a C-suite exec from the creative and media industry. He's been a journalist in his past, executive coach. And most recently, he's founded his own venture where he helps leaders really build the physical energy, the mental clarity, and the emotional balance with a view to helping them perform at their best in a sustainable way. I think that last bit's really important, right, Jason? We've talked about that a lot.
Absolutely.
So welcome to the podcast, Jason. We're thrilled to have you. Say a little bit more about you.
You've summed it up perfectly. And thank you so much. It's a real privilege to be on this podcast. Essentially, I think leadership has never been tougher. And the reason I founded Prime Performance Labs is because I think the current support systems are largely languishing in the 1990s. Everything we know about the mind and body connection, advances we've made in neuroscience and in technology have given us great insights into what constitutes prime performance. And I think, unfortunately, there's a world where that's been embraced in areas like elite sports, but the vast majority of boardrooms haven't embraced these opportunities to support leaders better and let them show up not just better in role, but also better in life.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? If you think about a Messi or, top footballers, they'll be practicing and perfecting and tweaking and optimizing their performance. And it's strange to me somehow why that doesn't necessarily always translate into the working environment. And maybe if I can kick us off, simply put, you're really about helping leaders think better, perform better, feel better in their day-to-day. What do you think leaders need to do in order to get more of that performance and balance in their day-to-day lives?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the critical thing here is everybody's different, at the risk of saying the obvious. So I think there's no sense of this being a one-size-fits-all system. It's very much about a couple of things going in harmony. So having that integrated approach in terms of your mind and body is absolutely critical. I think the easiest way to explain that is talking about it through the lens of hardware and software. So if your hardware isn't functioning properly, I think it's fair to say your software is going to be extremely buggy. And so in this context, we're talking about fundamentals like sleep, recovery, nutrition, and movement, all of which are absolutely critical for your cognitive health and performance. And the reason that we focus a lot on the cognitive aspect is if you look at great leadership, it's a critical factor. Cognitive performance will determine your ability to manage stress, your ability to make complex decisions under pressure, your ability to creatively problem solve, and your ability to regulate your emotions. So we're in a world now where cognitive health and performance can increasingly be measured and can be improved, just like you'd look to improve your physical capacity in the gym, for example. So I feel this is the new frontier, but really would allow leaders to supercharge their performance.
Mm-hmm.
I totally agree. And in your experience, Jason, what inner system bugs most often limit performance cultures, and how can organizations start working on them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think if we're talking in a system, I think one thing to stress on the hardware side of things, so physiology, is we're not trying to turn everybody into athletes. This is about just instilling fundamental good lifestyle changes. So again, tangible example, instead of grabbing the phone first thing in the morning and falling for the glamorization of busy, get that 15-minute walk in outside, exposure to sunlight. So helps your circadian rhythm, so you'll sleep better, helps with cortisol, and so mood enhancement. And as I'm sure many on this call would agree and beyond, walking can be a great form of moving meditation. Just finding that white space that can be so elusive as a leader. So creating these finite windows. So again, this isn't about trying to carve out unrealistic amounts of time. It's about recognizing what can be integrated into your daily lifestyle that allows it to be sustainable. Now, in terms of the second part of the inner system, if we're talking about essentially software, purpose, meaning, group dynamics, I think there's so much to unpack there, isn't there? And as we know, because of power dynamics in the workplace, the importance of leaders showing up in the right way is absolutely critical. And again, neuroscience proves this in terms of that having a direct impact on everyone around them. So it's called neuro mirroring. So one of the things I think that's I'd be very interested to get your take on is I've seen a lot of noise about bringing your authentic self to work. I would push back on that pretty strong because I think it tends to be misinterpreted as things like just show up and show all your emotions just in the same way you would if you had a completely...
Say it how it is.
Exactly. Which as a leader is terrible, right? You know, I mean, again, we literally know that moods are infectious. And so you showing up as your raw, authentic self in an untethered manner can actually be incredibly destabilizing, depending on the individual. So something like emotional regulation is critical in the workplace when you're in a leadership role. And just to be clear, by regulation, I don't mean suppression. Emotions can be an incredible asset. As we move into the era of AI, we should be leaning more into what makes us fundamentally human. And, you know, when we think about our finest moments, whether that's in leadership or in life, we tend to frame it through the lens of, I feel, or I felt. And the same applies here, but it's about understanding that you have agency over your relationship with your emotions, as opposed to having this attitude of, I'm just going to let them rip. And we will all have heard in the past, and no doubt will in the future, somebody saying, I can't help it. It's the way I'm wired. Well, sorry, I hate to tell you, science says differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, it's so important not to put on a mask, but be in control of your emotions and to be aware of who am I meeting in this meeting and how much of myself can I be in order for them to feel safe and secure. So it's just about, like you said, regulation in the right way at the right time.
Yeah, Carl, I think that's such a wonderful way to frame it, because you're right, because that mask implies a level of inauthenticity. And of course, what we all know is actually effective leadership requires authenticity. You know, one example that I use again is from the world of sports, where if you look at Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic, three all-time greats, three incredibly different styles of play. And if any of them had simply tried to copy the other, they would have been nowhere near as effective. So you're absolutely right. It's not about a mask or, hey, this is how Elon or Jeff Bezos does it, so therefore I need to do this. Authenticity is absolutely critical for sure. And as you rightly said, it's just about recognizing the role you're playing. And I think that's where the lens of service leadership becomes really crucial. You know, so it becomes less around how do I think I should show up, and more like how can I show up best for my team.
Wow. And on this topic, you know, I am a Liverpool football fan, mad. So forgive me for bringing the Jurgen Klopp into it. I'll alienate all the Man United folks on the call listening to this. But he and Pep and all of the great football managers talk a lot about this highly personalized, measured way of interacting very differently with their players, depending on what their players need from them not, you know, what their authentic self is. So when I think about the very best leaders I've worked with in my career, Jason, that they have this ability to be able to tap into their individual leadership team to really get the very best out of them. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Absolutely. You have to have that hyper-personalized approach. And I'll use the Liverpool example because I ended up writing one of my newsletters about this about 4 months ago. So on his slot, when he came in, he did something that's quite unusual in leadership still. And as leaders, and I was certainly guilty of this, you have a tendency to focus on who you consider to be the underperformers. I've got to raise these guys up. And in terms of your stars, there's an element of set and forget. Like, they're doing really well. It's right and proper that I devote my time to helping those who I believe have the potential to get better. Now, what Arne Slot did when he came in was he actually went to Mo Salah and said, "You are a fantastic player. I think I can make you even better." And again, personal development plan, and we saw the result last season, Mo Salah's greatest ever season. And for me, I think that's a great insight as well in terms of leadership, having that hyper-personalized approach, but also in terms of allocation of time, because the ability of a star performer to get 5% better, for example, can have an utterly disproportionate effect, not just on commercial performance, but again, if we ladder back up to culture, them showing up better sets a standard that others can aspire towards and learn from organically.
I just want to pick up on that because I was listening to a podcast yesterday with David Deutsch, totally different field, not in sports, but in sort of quantum mechanics and all sorts of other things. But he was kind of making a similar point around the idea of efficiency, where we're kind of hypersensitive to looking at something like efficiency. If you can do this, if you can master that skill, if you can unlock this workflow, then yes, you will be 10% or 20% more efficient. But really, in real terms, you're actually becoming 99% more efficient, because until you're able to unlock something that is, or unblock something perhaps, then that is always going to be alien to what you can do. And all of the other opportunity costs, all the things you're not able to see or to experience because of that efficiency not being unblocked, is then forever going to remain, away from you. So it's a great way to see, how small incremental, maybe 1 or 2% shifts in efficiency or productivity actually end up unlocking so much more than just what those numbers sound like to us.
Yeah, I think that's such profound insight, Alex. I couldn't agree with it more. It's, these what looks like incremental changes can compound dramatically. And that applies, again, on a broader workplace level. But again, this applies to our work with individual leaders, just building in these rituals, these habits. They're not sexy, but there's a magic in consistency, right? And again, to go back, Sarah, to your football analogy, it's, I know somebody who did some work with Cristiano Ronaldo, and they basically said his daily routine is what others would consider incredibly boring. Chicken and broccoli and rice for lunch every day. There's a wonderful study from a number of years ago called The Mundanity of Excellence. And it was based on Olympic swimmers in the States. And they'd have visiting coaches from overseas who wanted to know what the secret sauce was of these great US swimmers. And came away relatively disappointed because, of course, there was no secret sauce. There was just this A, relentless commitment to consistency and practice, but B, also, I think the other overlooked superpower is intentionality. So they're not just going up and down mindlessly. They're looking to tweak things that in our world would be so utterly tiny, but they recognize, again, the compound interest of making those small tweaks to performance add up to something that's world-class. And so, Alex, to bring it back to your point, I think that's equally applicable to the workplace for sure.
Can I dig into that for a moment? Because firstly, totally agree. But what's interesting is that I find myself asking this sort of question quite a lot lately. And it's around what needs to be the drivers or the sort of motivation or perhaps willingness around moving into these sorts of habits, these sorts of rituals, because we're certainly, if nothing else, we're overwhelmed and bombarded with all the things we should be doing.
Yeah.
All the great advice that's out there. I can listen to 15 minutes of almost any type of podcast, or take a cursory look at LinkedIn too, but YouTube or anything like that, and I will be told all the great pieces of advice. I don't even need to work with a coach to pay them $500 an hour. I can just be, I can have access to all the great free information, all the habits I should take. Starting the day without a phone, watching what I eat, all of these things that absolutely will make my life better and make me show up as a better leader. But surely then, if we are having all this access to all this right information, why are we still having these sorts of conversations? Because
that's a great question.
Something's not sinking in, So what's going on under the hood, do you think?
I think there are a few variables. I think I'll start with what, to some degree, is a statement of the obvious, but simple doesn't equal easy. So I think that's something we need to establish. It can actually be very difficult to stick to things to the extent that you start to wire in those neural pathways and establish them as habits and rituals. Secondly, to your point, I think in the distraction economy we now live in, it's information overload and indeed overwhelm. So if you're starting from a limited knowledge base, then what do you believe? And there's always the seduction of quick fixes. We see that a lot with tech. I think tech can be wonderful in terms of tools, but I think this idea that you can give over agency of your own life to a piece of tech is not healthy. And again, creates these spirals where you are constantly searching for that next quick fix and then get disappointed when it doesn't happen. I think at the core, right, is that we can be information rich and insight poor. And so how do you filter and focus? And I think that's where an external partner, that can be a coach, that can be a colleague, it can be a friend, can be really valuable in terms of accountability. And there's also a lot of data to show that if you do something and you're not alone in doing it, it makes it easier to adopt. So I think that's another important principle. I think finally, environmental design, I think, is grossly overlooked as a really important factor. I'll give you a perfect example from this morning, but I hope it doesn't sound like a flex because it's not intended to be. But I was up and training this morning.
I've been running my 15K before I came on this podcast. That kind of flex, Jason.
Believe it or not, it was a handstand class. Not least because I know it's great for my cognitive health as well as my physical health.
It shows.
And I had a friend who said, "Oh, you train so consistently. You've got amazing willpower." And I rejected that, not from a humble brag perspective, but I said, look at my world. I'm fortunate enough to live in East London. I'm 10 minutes cycle ride from the biggest and probably the best movement studio in Europe. So I get access to world-class coaching. It's a wonderful community. So I get great social connection, and it's got a co-working space. So it's easy from an environmental design perspective. If I, as an individual, lived in a rural village with no access to a gym and had 3 children, there is no world in which I'm training as consistently and as well, not just in terms of investment of time, but also, again, that quality, back to intentionality again. So I think there's a situation where, Alex, to your point, so many of these individuals will beat themselves up. It looks so simple. Why can't I do it? And it's like, change is hard, right? I think it really underestimated how hard change is. And there's a reality. But many people will prefer the pain of the familiar to the unknown.
Mm.
Yeah. Alex, it makes me think about your colleague. We were on a podcast, I think it was probably 9 months ago, who was the endurance runner.
Yes.
And he talked about, endurance, like, 50K, 70K, insane amounts of running. But he talked, I think there's a lot of talk about intrinsic motivation and how we need to, get it from within or establish purpose for ourselves. But he said something that really stuck with me, which is that there's this one hill sort of at 30K into this hideous run that he does. And the only reason he kept running is because he promised his coach, who unfortunately had terminal cancer, that he would not stop running on that hill. And I just think that sometimes we get kind of obsessed with the need for intrinsic motivation. For sure, it's important, but sometimes it feels like there's a catalyst, an external catalyst, that maybe is the difference between, not doing versus doing, or walking for a little bit, or, continuing to run. So I love this sort of combi, like with most things, it's not simple, right? It's multivariate. You're talking about environmental design. We know that, finding purpose in what we're doing and the why is important. But I also wanted just to mention this sort of external stimulus, which I think sometimes is perhaps overlooked.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Sarah. And I think you're right in terms of it being nuanced. I think external can be useful almost as a guide rope when you need that extra. I think the danger is if you rely solely on external, that's when you can create these peaks and troughs, and you potentially end up in the world of artificial destinations. So you do something like a marathon, for example, and then you just drop off completely because you've ticked that box, versus recognizing that the marathon can be a great signpost on the way during your overall health and fitness journey. There's an incredible performance consultant from the States called Josh Waitskin, who was a global child chess prodigy, got burnt out, subsequently went on to become a world champion in pushing hands for the competitive form of Tai Chi. And he wrote an incredible book called The Art of Learning, which is the closest I've got to a Bible. And he speaks about the importance of relentlessly seeking out adversity to grow as an individual, whatever form that takes, mental, physical, emotional, because that's where true growth happens. And in terms of those external markers of success, I love the way he frames it. He talks about stop, smell the roses, enjoy that moment, but don't get caught up in being defined by it. And I think that's so critical, right? Because we all see people in the world of music, film, sports, who can potentially lose themselves through that quest for external validation.
And then it becomes fixed mindset somehow, right? Because you rely on that to be
That's
the
right.
fuel. And if it suddenly goes away.
And if you bring that back to the business world, again, it's leaders where they will lean into what made them successful in the first place. And so unintentionally can create a circle of wagons effect, versus having that experimental mindset. And that's really front of mind for me at the moment with AI, in terms of, and we saw this in the first wave of digital, those individuals who were like, it's a fad, it's a trend, this isn't going to impact me. And I think it requires bravery and courage to embrace that experimental and growth mindset, to recognize the world is changing. And if I want to be an effective leader, it's absolutely critical that I embrace that rather than retreat from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I would suggest you add some playfulness into that mix. So don't take things too serious. We all end up failing every now and then, but there are lessons to be learned from every failure as well. So
Yeah, Carl, I love that. I mentioned to Sarah previously one of the most profound pieces that I read when I was still in corporate life. So it'd have been about a decade ago and of course I was in the creative industries. So an article saying, think more like a scientist. Okay, you've got me hooked. Why? And I find it so eye-opening because it simply said, look, think about it. A scientist goes into an experiment expecting to fail and wanting to fail because it will throw up new data points that create a pathway of progress. And that reframing of failure for me was incredibly helpful. And I think that's applicable on an individual level and without question also in terms of a cultural level. You have to create a culture of psychological safety where teams feel empowered to fail and experiment. Because what else, right? It's stasis equals irrelevance.
Mm. Mm. And I think there's such an important piece here in reframing failure in this way, because failure is such a, even saying it, yeah, I feel this kind of weight on my shoulders. I feel like I'm slouching forward. I feel almost guilty. I feel like what? I need to go make up for this failure. Even just saying the word failure, it's insane what we inherit and how much of that lives in the words we use and the vocabulary that we make use of every day. But kind of reframing or rehabilitating the idea of failure, not just window dressing it and saying, oh, it's fine and it's okay and don't worry, fail, because often, aside from the talk of failure, in high pressure environments, if you do fail at something and you're about to lose £500,000 on something, or, that costs, 3 customers and that's going to, kill our revenue for the next quarter, the conversation is not that nice and it's not that nice. And so we can like the idea of it, but we're still not, enforcing that in practice. So how do you see being able to negotiate that in reality as well? This idea of rehabilitating failure, not just in words, but with actions too, because it's tough.
Yeah, it's so tough. And Alex, I mean, you know better than anyone, right? Words have such power. And I think what you've said there is so accurate because there are such heavy connotations around the word failure. And so consequently, you'll get people who will pay lip service to it. Yeah, definitely. We've got to have that culture. And then, of course, when it comes to the reality, okay, well, maybe, we'll just stick to the tried and tested for now. So I think if we look at leadership, I think it's critical to lead by example in this context. And that can be really difficult. We're hung up on things like status and identity. Failure can be seen to be at best ugly, at worst career damaging. And environmental design comes in once again in the workplace. How do you create, is it something like a R&D unit, for example? One of the things that always astonished me about working in media creative services was so much talk around innovation, so much talk around creativity, so little in practical terms. Like, why aren't there existing R&D units in the majority of big agencies or publishers? It's quite remarkable, I think, for me, that disconnect. And to your point, Carl, I think a truly misconceived notion of what constitutes play. Having a ping pong table in your company does not constitute play. Play in the workplace is allowing you to unleash your creative potential without it being attached to a financial outcome for me. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where you can unleash some incredible, again, experiments in this context and extract really meaningful insights that can lead to practical commercial outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. And I do workshops on creativity, where I normally take up the case where we address the whole problem the wrong way. We have a workshop in order to discuss a problem that we want to solve. And all we want, or all we actually do, is to lead each other in on a much more narrow way of looking at the problem, instead of discussing the problem in or from as many aspects as possible. then take a break for 2 hours, get out walking and come back, and then see what solutions have you come up with during your 2-hour walk. But
Love that.
we do that. We have a workshop where we tend to look at the problem and just narrow it down to, okay, this is the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And there's this wonderful temptation to say, hey, here's this lovely bow around it. We've solved it. And of course, the biggest problems in the business world right now are complex and messy. And very rarely is there a singular right answer, which is, again, why you need this constant sense of curiosity and experimentation. And I think to take it back to your point around failure, Alex, is whether it's individual or company level, I think it's almost like the unwritten contract in terms of clearly establishing where those boundaries are that constitute safe spaces to fail in, with a shared understanding regarding intention and outcomes.
Can I ask another question? This is just
Please.
So, you say something about courage.
Yes.
And the reason, and I want to hear what you have to say, but the reason I ask this is because, once again, in kind of exploring what's beneath or under the hood on all of these, tactics and things that we need to do, and performance and all that, and the habits, which all matter, like we've established. But underneath all that, there still seems to be some kind of metal or motivation that someone's going to have to be able to reach inside in order to realize, oh, okay, like you said, understanding the cost of not changing is greater than the cost of what that change is. And so but still at some point that does need to be, like you said, a moment of agency, a decision that somebody makes to realize, oh, okay, I'm going to actually take this on. I'm not going to blame someone else. I'm not going to put it on, someone else's desk. It starts with me, the buck stops here. And I think pretty much all the time, whenever we make those decisions in life, not just in the workplace, it does invite this moment of kind of willingness or courage to be able to go, okay, it is going to stop with me, and I am going to take full responsibility for what happens from now on. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think you framed it beautifully. And I think you're a living example of it, right? You're a serial entrepreneur, so that courage has been propelled by that deep sense of belief and purpose. And I think there can be a tendency in this world, particularly where tech dominates the conversation, to want everything to be measurable. And so things like purpose and meaning are, on occasion disregarded as woo-woo. Yet we are complex, nonlinear creatures. And again, fortunately, neuroscience sheds light on this. For example, I can't remember the exact statistic, but something in the region of 30% greater likelihood of developing Alzheimer's if you don't have a strong sense of purpose and meaning in your life. So I think that can be such a powerful force. When I stepped away from corporate life, without question, what gave me that courage, because I was most definitely scared, was that genuine belief that leadership has never been tougher, and there is a better way to support those leaders than is out there at the moment, that integrated approach. I think there's also, for me, a very interesting take on self-compassion. And again, I'm referencing an American performance coach called Steve Magness, who talks about self-compassion as being a combination of courage and wisdom, as opposed to weakness. And I really buy into that in a big, big way. And I think that can manifest itself in a number of ways, right? It's about recognizing, for example, that when, showing up at your best, sometimes that's going to be 40%. And that's okay, because actually what's more important is that you're conserving your energy, your capacity for those moments where they matter most. I think we all see in the commercial world far too many leaders operating in that simmering sick zone, where they're just trying to keep their head above water. It's always on mindset, constant firefighting mode. And this, I guess, gap between them in the simmering six where they are trying their best versus their knowledge of what their actual best looks like. And I think the only way to bridge that gap is by having that capability to tune into your own data and recognize when you need to be your best and what that looks like, and B, having the courage and self-compassion to recognize when you can drop down to a 2, a 3 out of 10, build in those recovery periods, just like an elite athlete. And I think that oscillation between the 10 out of 10 and the 2 out of 10 is really damaging, actually, in leadership capacity. I think there are a bunch of, if I use the athletics analogy, you've got guys who are brilliant 400-meter sprinters trying to maintain that pace over a marathon. So to your point about the hill, Sarah, that you mentioned, like when it comes to the point where you really need to climb that hill, there's not enough in the tank.
Yeah.
Jason, we've talked a lot about individual optimization, prime performance. Imagine I'm a CEO and I run a big organization and I want to bring some of these concepts to my leadership team. How do you think about designing an intervention like that?
So I think, at the risk of saying the obvious, it's starting with the fundamentals. I'm a massive believer in a concept that's really only talked about in physical performance, but is equally applicable here, which is progressive overload. So it goes back to Alex's point about, I kind of know all this information, but actually there's a paralysis. It can be overwhelmed. So what are those fundamentals that can be practical insights and takeaways in terms of how you can show up physiologically? And then what can you implement on a behavioral level that feels practical, relevant, and again, bespoke to that team's needs? So I think a diagnostic approach is always critical beforehand. I think we're in such a world where, and I'll be remarkably indiscreet here, you've got so many grifters who have a vested interest in promoting their own definitive model or framework. I love Bruce Lee's phrase, like, absorb what is useful, discard what is useless. And this goes back to authentic selves again, right? So I think share where possible, evidence-based information and insights, but emphasize to those individual team members, like, again, do what works for you. And again, that's where I think the experimental mindset is critical. If you're then talking about team as a collective, I think there are a number of things you can do. I think one of the things that I'd love to hear your opinions on this, but the illusion of geographical proximity. I know X because sat next to them for 3 years. I know Y because we've worked together for 2 years. And it can be remarkable. There's a lovely exercise where you get people to produce their personal operating manual. Just a simple one page, right? This is what gets the best out of me. These are my triggers. And it's remarkable when those are shared, you get some real aha moments where people realize their assumptions weren't accurate. But it creates this beautiful space of shared understanding and alignment, but means that when you have those unwritten contracts about how you proceed as a collective, you can be so much more effective, efficient. And as we all know, and Carl, I think it plays back to your concept of play. There's this wonderful magic and mood when you're all rowing in the same direction, shared sense of purpose, and doing work that feels very meaningful to you.
Reminds me of a time sorry, Carl.
No,
Go
I
ahead.
couldn't agree more. Creating a true purpose for the whole company, then it doesn't matter whether you're working on the floor or if you're part of the management team, you have the same purpose, and that's what motivates you to get out of bed in the morning and go do your best.
Absolutely. There's some now. I'm not sure if this is urban myth. I'm not familiar enough with the aviation industry to say categorically, but I heard recently on the podcast how a plane will take off to a destination and that can be several thousand miles away, and it's never a perfect route. There's this constant recalibration, getting back on course, minute adjustments. And I think that struck a chord with me because I think that's what we're talking about here in terms of if you're able to establish the purpose of a company, communicate that effectively throughout the workforce. And of course, external forces, buffering, turbulence is always going to take place. And that's okay. You are basically moving to recalibrate because you all have that shared sense of direction.
So you've talked today quite a lot about intentionality, Jason, and experimentation. Carl, one of the things that we really thrive on is this sort of experimental mindset. I think you've got a final question for Jason, haven't you?
Yes, absolutely. We've talked a lot about managers and leaders, and performance is not limited to them, of course. So if you would run one bold inner OS experiment tomorrow to help all employees to unlock their higher performance or personal performance, what would you suggest?
So I hope this doesn't sound too meta, but I would actually encourage them to commit intentionally to one experiment that they think could move their performance forward in a meaningful way within the workplace. So again, what that looks like, I think it's, we've seen, I think Anne-Marie's done a great job, Anne-Laure has done a great job in terms of popularizing this through tiny experiments, but creating that framework that makes things manageable. Because I think, Alex, this ties back into your point regarding failure. If you're embarking on an experiment versus this binary sense of I've committed to this goal, and if I don't reach it, I've somehow failed, experimental creates that element of play. So it's like, look, have a curious mindset, explore, commit to doing X for Y amount of time, that time being sufficient to gather data so you can ascertain whether your hypothesis is accurate or not. And I think you've suddenly embedded this culture there of A, positive progress, B, without the trappings and heavy weight of failure, and C, again, sharing those data points at the end of that experimental phase through the collective, I think, again, can only be a very powerful force.
That's super cool. We're asking that question of all of our guests just to start to move the needle on some of these important elements.
I think
Alex.
curiosity is such as, oh, so sorry, Sarah.
No, go ahead.
I was simply going to say it, and it's just, I think curiosity is such a leadership superpower, and is criminally ignored, and I think if there's a singular power of curiosity, is that progress is almost inevitable, right? As long as it's coupled with intention. Because I think to your point, Alex, about, the amount of content out there is insane, right? And so there can be that tendency to, I say this tongue planted in cheek, but almost do the Tinder equivalent of curiosity. Oh, I'm going to dabble here and look at this. And, there's not meaningful intention behind it. There's not proper interrogation of that data.
Curious. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
How curious I am. Yeah.
But it's like, I mean, again, with what you've done, I mean, I'm obviously a huge believer in storytelling, but I think what I love about what you've done is it's a definition of intention. It's like, because I think storytelling can be such an abused term itself, right?
Yeah.
And I think what you've done incredibly well is say, no, this is absolutely a fundamental human power, and has been since the dawn of time, right? And it's something again that I think is like it's so many things. It's a skill. One of the things I disliked, ironically, about being in media was this sense of we own storytelling, and you have the unintentional effects of excluding others. And I think it's untrue, of course, but B, creates barriers to participation that are really damaging. Yeah. And if we look at the creator economy, I see so many of my former colleagues very disparaging. I think there's something wonderful about the democratization of access. I love the idea that regardless of geography, somebody can tell their story to an audience and connect with them. It's beautiful, right? And that part of this, no pun intended, that part of the story is rarely told. So I think having somebody championing the skill and the art of storytelling, so powerful, particularly given the era we're moving into, where we're already seeing how information is being commoditized. And if I see another AI post written by LinkedIn, I may lose the will to live.
All the comments really get me. AI comments. I see a lot of them on my posts now, and they've got that hideous M dash.
Yes, that's it. It's like the telltale sign.
Yes, it's not an A, but it's a B. All of that. It just totally drives me up the wall. Yeah.
And again, I think that the jury's out at the moment, but I think I think we will see how this will show to be damaging to cognitive health. There's an older study showing how, I think it was London taxi drivers had enlarged hippocampuses because they had to memorize routes around London, right? In an era of Google Maps, like, who does that anymore? And I can see similar consequences for AI and outsourcing your intellect. And so anyone championing the human art of storytelling, I salute, quite frankly.
Just to quickly say something on that, I like to try and phrase these sorts of things, whether it's curiosity or storytelling, less as skills, because I think when we think of skills, it kind of sounds very sort of schoolish, and I've got to go and study for that. And it almost, I don't know, skills doesn't excite me. The idea of thinking about a skill, but rather thinking about it in terms of a technology, I think is interesting, because not only, can we reappropriate some language there, but also I think it speaks to this idea of an extension of what a human being can do. Just like, Homo habilis crawling out of trees, finding, sticks and stones to break coconuts open. That's a technology. AI is a technology. Conversation is a technology. Curiosity, these are technologies that we use to accomplish and do things, just like storytelling. So it's great to be able to see that technology doesn't always have to be technologic or electronic, shall we say.
Yes. You're reclaiming it.
Yeah, reclaiming, but also just rather seeing that there's a broader spectrum of experience that we can always be open to. That helps us to fill in the answer when someone is saying to us, but just be more human, or just be authentic, or here's what the human side of it looks like, right? Okay, well, what does that mean? How can we color that world in a bit more? Yeah.
So I'm broadly in agreement. I think the challenge, as we all know, is it's actually back to that concept of creating a pathway of progress, so progressive overload. And I think for me, I know there are definitely leaders, but just broadly individuals where if I spoke through the language of technology, they potentially look a bit baffled. I had this when I got incredibly excited about the lens of neuroscience. I was speaking to incredible female entrepreneur who I've known for some time, and because I'd gone on my own journey down the rabbit hole, and I'm like, a neuroscience this and that, and 5 minutes of me doing this very passionate monologue and what exactly is neuroscience? And so the reason I'll use skills as a device on that pathway is simply because I think the problem in societal terms is that things like storytelling are looked at in very binary terms. So, oh no, I can't do it, you know. And I think we see that with far too much, right? Where we unintentionally throw up barriers. Dr. Brendan, who I work with, he's our chief scientific advisor, phenomenal neuroscientist working in the intersection of exercise and mental health. And has done some groundbreaking research there. And for example, with health and fitness, he says in the era of social media, the conversation has been hijacked by extremists. You know, these guys you see on Instagram are the 1%, and unintentionally, that can mean that those individuals who are sitting on the sofa, it's just like, I can't do this. I can't do this. Versus, hey, do you know what? That 15-minute walk is fantastic for you, physically and mentally. And it releases all sorts of good stuff in your body. So just get started. So sorry, that was a rather long response, which is simply that A, I agree with you, but B, I think one of my learns has been finding the right language to unlock that first step of the journey.
Mm.
Even if it's something that we ourselves wouldn't necessarily subscribe to.
Yeah. Mm.
Beautiful. Well, I'm going to be the party pooper here because I know that we need to let you get back to your busy schedules. But Jason, just close us off. Give us 3 things that leaders should think about in this area.
Okay. Cognitive health and performance, criminally neglected. It is absolutely fundamental to great leadership. So understand it, understand how sleep, movement, and nutrition impact that and your ability to show up in role. Secondly, I think understand the importance of acting in your true authentic self in the world where you are bombarded by hailographies, the pressure of being told you should be like X or act more like Y. No, absolutely not. You do not need to be in that ice bath at 4 a.m. It's performative nonsense. Do not get distracted by it. And I think the third part relates to that, which is tune into your own data. And I mean that physically, mentally, and emotionally. I think as we lose ourselves in the glamorization of busy, there can be this temptation to operate on autopilot, to ignore the signals your own brain and body are telling you, and to seek to outsource agency for your well-being to a piece of tech or a third party. Like, nobody knows your body and brain better than you. But again, there is a skill and an art to understanding those data signals and interpreting them. So in a world where you always feel like you don't have enough time, self-reflection, whatever form that takes, whether that's meditation, whether that's walking, creating that white space, is absolutely critical and is undoubtedly an investment that will compound positively.
Brilliant. Jason, such a pleasure. Thank you so much. Guys,
Genuine
as always,
privilege. Thank you.
So much fun to spend an hour of my day with you all. So thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.
Take care, guys.
Take care.